if all the Rotarians, if you see some strange names, I introduced some of my guests that were were kind enough to be for the whole program, but you'll see some other names popping on here. And many of those are
Oh,
actually people with metastatic breast cancer that Mary has gotten to know. So I invited all those people if they wanted to join. Okay. And I wasn't able to screen share because I just have a new computer. I can't figure out my security. So Tara's going to be my person to go. So that's the presentation. Go ahead, next slide. I'll give you my caveats. Okay. Yes, I am Rob Gooze. I am not a doctor or a scientist. Okay. There is no MD next to my name. But when you deal with a disease like cancer, you end up learning a lot. So, yeah, I've spent 9 years, as you probably know, working with Mary, dealing with her breast cancer, of which the last 6.5 years now has been metastatic breast cancer, MBC. Okay, is often the term for metastatic breast cancer. So, on my own, I've done a lot of research, a lot of doctor Googling, but trying to find the right doctor sites, but also to understand more about metastatic breast cancer that I've actually attended in person and then online for 3 of the last 4 years, the largest breast cancer symposium I think in the world in San Antonio. If you want to ever have an interesting experience, you go to one of these giant cancer symposiums, of which much of the programs are done by someone who English is not their first language, talking science way above anything you could possibly know. So, fortunately, for a couple of the symposiums, Mary's oncologist, Dr. Yamil Arbahi, also was attending. So often he'd sit next to me and would poke me in the side to tell me when to wake up because it was something I may be able to understand and appreciate. So that's been a lot of my knowledge has come through these symposiums. I also subscribe to a thing called Onc Live, Oncology Live, and watch programs on that. And then I bug the people at SSM Dean and, of course, all the Carbone scientists and physicians that we've gotten to know. Also, Mary and I have spent a lot of the last 5, 6 years reviewing research projects. I've done it for ACS. Actually, Mary did it for Department of Defense, and I may be doing that this year. We've done it for a group called Metaviver. And then I think most of you know we have the One Woman, Many Lakes, where we fund research for metastatic breast cancer, but we carefully review those projects before deciding to fund them. Okay. So I do have a little more knowledge than the general layperson, but I am definitely not a doctor or a scientist. So please don't ask me those tough questions. And I'm going to be talking about clinical trials for drugs. We're not talking about what a vaccine trial is like. I have no idea exactly how the COVID-19 vaccines go through a trial process. I'm going to be talking about drugs. Go ahead, next. Okay. So first, how does a drug or treatment get developed? Okay. And it's a lot of science, a lot of labs, and a lot of time and research. So it often just starts in, as I say, in a petri dish. You end up doing a lot of mouse or other animal studies. If you look at cancer, you'll see a lot of these poor white mice with cancer growing out of their bodies because they're constantly testing on these mice. There's also other studies through the DNA or CRISPR. I won't get into those in detail, but the main kind of people that fund these basic initial research, the biggest is by far the National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute. Those are the abbreviations, NIH, NCI. Then you'll have university labs like the one here in Wisconsin, the WIMR, and other foundations can fund this kind of research. Uh, Many other big breast cancer foundations, or an example, the One Woman Many Lakes More for Stage 4 Fund funds this kind of research. It can take years to develop, though. The initial research even become translational. They're publishing in different scientific journals. They're demonstrating their research at these conferences like San Antonio. So it's not uncommon to be 8, 12 years from very raw research till something what we call can be translated into the next step. The next step is usually now the dollars get to be pretty big to invest to look at a new drug application. So often a big pharma, a big pharmaceutical company gets involved in this. And just the bottom line, I mentioned that did some research and it appears that about only 1 in 1,000 drugs that enter preclinical testing, okay? So it's kind of translational testing becomes human testing, gets approved for human testing. Next. Okay, so what is a clinical trial? And this is right out of National Institute of Health. I'll give you 5-10 seconds to kind of read it. But it is a new treatment. It can be drug or even a device. Is it safe and effective? Okay. But notice the last sentence. It's not just maybe something brand new, but it can also be something, is this a little more effective on an existing drug or treatment? Or is this something that's being given to someone, which when you're dealing with cancer, has less harmful side effects? So many of these newer drugs is just a sort of adjustment on a current drug, but gives you less side effects, which is critical for a patient. Next. There are 4 phases of a clinical trial. And again, you're trying to find the right dosage, side effects, and if a treatment actually works, okay? Then usually after what's called phase 3, that's the one that gets approved for clinical use, but you continue to monitor it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're not in numbers, they're in Roman numeral numbers for some reason. Next. Lots of stuff here. A phase 1, though, is a fairly small trial to just judge its side effects and find the right dosage. Again, those things have been tested in an animal stage to see what is a proper side effect, because before it's approved for even a phase 1 into a human, the pharmaceutical or whoever is asking for this first phase 1 trial has to be really, really careful, because it is not a good, I hate to say it, it is not a good test if their patients are dying, okay? So those things have to be tested, and often at a very low dosage to make sure it is safe. So at a phase 1, you're not judging whether a drug is effective. You're looking at the side effects and the safety and the dosage. That's why it's a very small group there, just to get a sense. The most common trials that patients like Mary look at is the phase 2. Believe it or not, again, this is much different than I believe a vaccine. That trial may only be 100 to 300. And the example I'll give, that can be around the world. So these are not giant 3,000, 30,000 people, but it's enough to give the effectiveness to start seeing, is this drug working? Well, they continue to monitor the side effects. And again, though, when you're dealing with safety and side effects, all these trials are fairly short term. That's why they will continue to monitor what's going on. The phase 3 trial is then the bigger one. Now it's shown in phase 2 that it's effective. The side effects are tolerable. So then they expanded, you can see, to several hundred to about 3,000. And then that's the one that's really hoping to show that it's working, that then the FDA can then approve it as a new treatment, drug, or whatever there. So that's the phase 3 trial. Often you'll go fairly quickly from phase 2, then to phase 3. Then once the drug is approved, the trial is still what's called a phase 4, but you're looking still if any other monitoring all these other effects going on. Is it still effective? Is the safety okay? Okay. So some of this can be monitored over 5 years plus just to make sure the side effects are okay. Next. So to be a new drug to get an approval, that's the application. It's called a new drug application. Of course, I've never written one of these things. I'm just reading about them. So again, I went back a couple slides, only 1 in maybe 1,000 drugs get to be actually tested in a human. Once you've made that, then about 1 in 5 may get approval, okay? And that's one of the big changes over the last 5-10 years for just talking to scientists, that the costs are so dramatic to try to get a drug approved. Oh, go back.
Oh, sorry.
Back.
Oh
Nope,
God.
the other way. You know what you get, you get what you pay for. Okay.
Is this the right one?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Sorry,
So
my elbow hit it.
get approval, but 1 in 1,000 may get to this stage to get to the phase 1, because it's cost so much that pharma companies are now looking at the science, i.e., let's say more for stage 4 is funding something at Carbone. They have to show that this thing has a decent chance that it's actually going to work in a human. That pharma companies aren't going to spend $3, $4, $5, $10 million on these trials to come up with a new drug unless they have a little better chance. So there's 1 in 5, 20% chance to get approval. So when you go back to the very raw research, from then to go to phase 1 to phase 4 or phase 3 and get it approved, it could be 12, 18 years. There's a drug on TV that's kind of like one of the quote miracle drugs for metastatic breast cancer that in many cases has increased the life expectancy of someone with MBC, called Ibrance. You may see that on TV quite a bit. I believe there was actually a book written about the making of Ibrance, and I think that was about 12 to 15 years from the beginning until it was approved by the FDA for patients to use. So a drug takes a long time to get approved. This isn't like a COVID, well, raw research to the market. Okay, next. So now people, if you watch on TV and you'll see all these drugs on there saying in a clinical trial, this was tested. And science of diseases and cancer specifically has to deal with a clinical trial. It has to be proven that it works in a very strict protocol method. So first, why does a person choose a clinical trial? Because I know Mary and many others are a constant ask, hey, are you on a clinical trial? If not, why not? And researchers and doctors are always pushing clinical trials. So for Mary's case as a metastatic breast cancer patient, why would we choose a clinical trial? Well, first, MBC unfortunately is a terminal disease. A lot of people don't forget that or don't realize that the treatments do not cure her cancer. It's just trying to extend the quality of life, longer and longer with a decent quality of life. Okay. So when someone has MBC, you are almost always on a treatment. If it continues working, you stay on that treatment as long as you have tolerable side effects. But then sometimes those treatments stop working and you go through all the possible treatments and the oncologist and yourself decide, oh, you're getting too much progression. And we talk about progression. Tumor growth often is it a big P that is progressing fairly rapidly and aggressively? Or is it a small P that, yeah, the tumors are growing, but they're still somewhat under control? But if it's a big P and these treatments seem to not be working, then you often will be looking at a clinical trial. Or you may have treatments that are working, but unfortunately you keep throwing enough treatments into somebody's body that are trying to kill cancer cells, also has too many side effects. And a common one is your neuropathy, where the patient will lose feelings in their fingers and feet, or even other parts of the body. And if that gets to be such that you can't really have a decent quality of life, you may have to stop that treatment, even though it's keeping your cancer under control. So the goal of a clinical trial, similar to going on any other known treatment, is to extend the quality of life. And maybe the clinical trial will have a miracle cure because it is something new out there. You can always hope for that. But the basic goal in these trials, if you read the fine prints, always talk about how many more months has this extended somebody's quality of life over an existing treatment. Okay, next. So Mary's prior treatments, just to show you, this is unfortunately is a good example of someone with metastatic breast cancer. When she was diagnosed June 20th of 14, her breast cancer had come back into her bone. She had it in her, I think, her left hip. It came out in a bone scan. Okay. That's what called metastatic, means it has spread to another part of the body, because breast cancer basically will not kill you in your breast. It's when it gets to other parts of the body. So it was originally in her bone. So she started on a drug called Afinitor and with some other inhibitors in there. And that drug had only been out for, I think, a year or two when she started it, and it was quite successful. She was on it a little over 2 years when she showed in scans that she'd be scanned at least probably once a quarter, if not every 2 months, showed that the the cancer had now spread to other bones. So breast cancer, similar to many other cancers, but especially breast cancer, unfortunately, a treatment, it becomes resistant to that treatment. The cancer cells are really, really smart, and they find a way around those treatments. So the cancer cells figured out Afinitor and said, nope, I'm going to grow even with Afinitor in me now. Thus, Mary had to change to another treatment. I have a little thing in the parentheses. These are what there actually are, different kind of what's called pathway inhibitors. So Ibrance was a totally different inhibitor. That one also was not, I think, FDA approved till about 2014 or 15. So it was fortunate it was there for her when she started that in early of 2017. And she was on that for basically 2 years when she had to stop that because now the cancer was discovered in more bones and now in her liver. So then she started on a chemotherapy that was working very, very well, but unfortunately had heart issues and other side effects. So I had to stop that. Went to a new drug that worked for a little bit. And if you kind of notice, as she goes on different drugs over time, each one kind of works a little less. And that's sort of common in metastatic breast cancer, that each drug or each treatment, that now 5 or 6 treatments later, each one doesn't work as long as maybe the first couple. Because again, the cancers have gotten smarter and smarter in being resistant to treatments. So her last one that she was on started basically this summer, and the oncologist had to stop it in December due to some progression and the side effects. She was on 8 cycles of this really ugly chemotherapy. And when I always talk about chemotherapy, think about it as putting Roundup in your body and you're trying to kill the fast growing cells. So you're trying to kill the fast growing dandelions. But if you throw Roundup in your body for too long, then the side effects can become fairly devastating. So that way, even though it was kind of still working, the side effects were such we had to stop that. Okay, that's enough on Mary's background. Next. So how we choose a specific trial, people have to look at, and we had to face this here. So one, what's the phase? Ideally, we'd love to have a phase 3 because then you know that the treatment has been working. You have some background on that. Or maybe there's something in your genes, and I'll get to that in a second, or an existing or new drug. So the major source is this NCI database for clinical trials. And then you also have a foundation one, which is genetic. You'll see, I think on the next slide on that. Be aware those sites can be in cancer centers all around the world. And normally for these trials, it could be 20 to 40 different places in the country. But we didn't almost realize this. Once you're committed to a site, you must stay until that trial is over, or you decide to pull off, or the drug or the treatment stops working. Like we were hoping Mary could start a trial here at Carbone, and then there was a treatment center that was also doing this same trial down in Los Angeles area. So we could spend the winter down still in Palm Desert and then run over there. But no, once we start a trial somewhere, we have to stay there, okay? So you have to very carefully decide where you want to go, okay? Is it recruiting new patients? Some trials may have already gotten their limit of how many they want. I'll talk about randomized or non-randomized. This is a good one because people ask us, oh, do you get a placebo or not? Does the treatment have some record of success, even though it's a new, especially phase 1 or 2? And you start reading the many, many pages of side effects. Okay, next. So Mary twice has gone through, and now when you have cancer, it's pretty much a given. You want to do genetic testing to see
Oops.
back to see what mutations you have in your genes. I think a lot of people know about the BRCA1 and 2 for breast cancer, but there's also other mutations that could be in your genes in your cancer. So they actually look at the tumor cell itself through a biopsy. So Mary had that done most recently in May of 2020, which showed some of these findings, that some things that could be in trials that work against those specific genomic findings. So you see on the screen, they even list trials. So that was a great place for us to start, was looking at those trials. And then we consulted with the people at Carbone, because there's some really good people that understand the genetic side to say, okay, which ones should we even focus on? And then on the right side were some of the drugs actually Mary had already been on, all those drugs listed on the right-hand side. Next.
How do you even pronounce those drugs?
That's why I use a generic term called Ibrance,
Oh,
palbociclib, okay? And everolimus is actually Afinitor. So
okay.
the doctors only know them by those names. They love the IBS. Okay,
Yeah.
so
It's
why did we choose Madison? because there were some decent trials down in the Chicago area. There were trials out in Seattle. But once we made that commitment, we had to be here. So one, COVID, it's not like you can fly back and forth every week somewhere like in maybe the old days or pre-COVID. We have that new granddaughter, I think you're all aware of, here in Cottage Grove. So that was like, hey, we want to be able to see that granddaughter. And it was winter, and I'm a winter driving wimp. And I really don't want to drive down to Chicago and hang out in a cold car somewhere for 5, 6 hours or more, at least once a week, because it's weekly treatments. So one of the ones we looked at was this one called Summit, because she had a mutation that qualified. This was an interesting one though, because it's randomized. So there were a third of the patients got basically this very basic drug that Mary had been on and off in the past. A third of the patients got that basic drug and another one, but then a third of the patients, only a third, got the real drug that they were testing. You would know which one group you're in, but if you were in the groups that never got the real drug, you'd have to wait 8 weeks to switch if there was progression, which is common. They give the drugs 8 weeks to work to see. So basically not a placebo, but she wouldn't have the real drug that we wanted her to be on. She had a 1/3 chance we would know at the front end, because this drug was called Naratabid. It seems like it could be a good one based on her mutation, because they had some success, but this Naratabid also had some really ugly side effects. So we decided, not knowing for sure whether Mary would be that 1/3 that had the Naratabid, we said, no, thank you to that one. And instead, next slide, chose this one. How's that for a word? The enfortumab vedotin, EV, which was an interesting drug because it had been approved just about a year ago for metastatic bladder cancer. So they had trials of that. Okay, and this was a trial from about a year ago. And again, maybe this is shocking for everybody listening to this, but even a trial that it was approved, this was for metastatic bladder cancer, it produced responses in 44% of the patients, and their survival was another 7 months, and 38% responded to the treatment in their liver. That's considered successful, okay? That even though half the patients did not see any success out of this drug, that is considered a successful drug that got approved. So next slide. So this trial at Carbone is an EV phase 2 trial, where they're taking this EV drug that was approved a year ago for bladder cancer, and instead is testing it on people with breast cancer, like Mary's, triple negative breast cancer. You can see cell lung cancer, head and neck cancer, gastric, esophageal cancer. It's called a basket study because each of these cancers have a very similar protein in the science to what was in the bladder cancer. Thus, there may be a chance that this could work, okay? What's nice about this is it's non-randomized. All 240 participants, that's 240 around the world, get this drug, this EV drug. And now we'll see if it works. So Mary has an infusion on days 1, 8, and 15 of every cycle. She's actually on her second infusion of this drug, day 8, right now today. Next. The locations, yeah, we could have done this out in Seattle, seen our grandkids out there, but be stuck there, which actually warmer in Seattle, but we'd miss the new grandbaby here. So no, we decided to do it here. And the main sponsor is a big pharma company, Astellas. Next. The criteria, only the healthy, we often say, qualify, because people say, we know, unfortunately, too many women that would have loved to have been on a clinical trial late in their cancer treatments, but they did not qualify, okay? So there's a lot of details here. I think this is being recorded. You can go back and look at it. But if you know anything about platelets and hemoglobins and all these other kind of basic health pieces of you, these are not uncommon to have a platelet under 100, okay? If you're on cancer treatments or your hemoglobin's below 9. Well, you can see you have to be above that. Anybody in the nursing home business may know what an ECOG is, but that's basically how can you get around functioning on your own type of thing. So you had to be fairly self-sufficient functioning. Next. So there's all sorts of other stuff there. The big thing on why one reason we chose this trial was it's a requirement you cannot have more than 2 lines of cytotoxic, which is chemotherapy. Okay. Mary has already had uh, two chemotherapies. Okay. So if she had gone on a 3rd chemotherapy, she would not be eligible for this trial. So that's another reason why we chose this trial, because she's at the limit of 2. Next. Some of the exclusions, you can't have too high of a neuropathy, okay? You can't have some other issues on her heart. You can't have eye issues. The bottom right hand on the column there says active keratitis or corneal ulcerations. You'll see why all these things are important of exclusions. Next. Well, we'll tape it. So for us to even sign up for it, we had to deal with a wonderful person called Brittany, whose sole job at Carbone is to work with people as clinical trials, because she's the clinical research coordinator. It's a 30-page document. She had to go over page by page with us to make sure we understood it. No, I'm not going to bore you with all 30 pages. Next. So they're screening though. So within what happens on a trial, you have 28 days before starting the trial. You have to read and sign it. They look at your medical history. They see how you feel. Mary had to keep a diary log of everything, how she feels. Then look at all the tests. You want to talk about being a lab rat. So in January, Mary spent most of her time getting scanned, getting an echocardiogram, physical exams. She had a 2.5-hour eye exam. Then fortunately, we had tumor tissue at SSM Health from May that they could use. If not, she was going to have to also go through a biopsy. So she was quite the lab rat, of which then 8 weeks from now, to see if this trial drug is working, she'll probably go through almost all these scans again to see if it's working and if there are any side effects. That's why these scans were very, very detailed. So that took up much of her time over the last couple of weeks. Next. You go over the detail and the risks. Okay, as I say, about 8 weeks from now, you see if it's working and what are the side effects, where you're going to have the CT, MRI scans and other scans there. But you can quit anytime if you don't like the side effects or you want to start a new treatment. But it's not like you're required to go through it. If you just say enough is enough. You know, again, we're fortunate here. It's an easy drive to get over to Carbone from our house. But for a lot of people to be on a trial, that's a major commitment. They may have to drive down, stay in a hotel for the day of treatment or whatever, the night before. So each day right now, this is her 2nd time. It's probably taken 6-7 hours over at the hospital at Carbone. Next. So her first infusion was the 22nd. I can't tell you how she feels or anything from it, basically, because in trial data has to stay totally within the trial until the trial is published. But you can see all the things she gets done in her day, like today. Today's her 2nd one here. But it's kind of interesting. She's used to getting infusion treatments. And she said it was very interesting that this one, they even had to flush through the final drug to make sure the exact amount of the drug got in her. And then when she was on the drug, they had to monitor. Normally they just put the drug in you and they walk away, the nurses. Here she was monitored for the whole time carefully to see if any side effects. And then even a 60-minute follow-up to see if she had any reaction. So she had a journal now, everything for any effects. So this last week, she's been keeping a journal of exactly how she feels. Even if she has a sniffle or she has to take another drug, like she has a headache, like Tylenol or something, she has to document it because they need to know everything specific for that trial, which is happening to anybody else that's on that trial. Next. And that's really it on Mary's trial. And I left myself a couple minutes for questions, but I'll stay on. So go ahead. You can kill the slide.